And I'm sure you're all enjoying this book as much as I am. It's really very different, isn't it, from most of the books we've read so far. Chapters 11 through 20 of Miss Mackenzie take us on a dramatic ride with social manipulations, competing suitors, and even a death. However, surely the apogee of these chapters is the hairpin turn that occurs in chapter 17, which is ironically titled Mr. Slow's Chambers, the blandness of the title being completely at odds with the momentous events that occur within. That event abruptly shifts the tone of the novel from somewhat of a comedy to more of a tragedy. There are rest stops along the ride of these chapters, populated by the various men who are vying for Miss Mackenzie's hand, assuming that her soft hand is clutching a fistful of pounds. We continue to learn more of the character of Miss Mackenzie, a woman with a solid foundation of kindness and strength and a strong moral compass, characteristics which provide necessary traction to her as she navigates that frightening turn. The fact that the narrative moves forward in a very linear manner without numerous or competing storylines that are more typical of Trollope's longer works add to the sense of urgent forward movement along that dangerous road. In chapter 11, Miss Todd entertains some friends at tea. We find ourselves at the tea party that was planned in the previous chapter. And this chapter is all about finding a husband for Miss M. The very first paragraph, in fact, ends with the sentence, "A woman's life is not perfect or whole until she has added herself to a husband." Miss Mackenzie herself desires to be married and dreaded delay in that purpose. However, for reasons that are not entirely clear, at least to me, she also holds an opposing or at least complicating view that, quote, "Who was she that she should be allowed to be in love? Was she not an old maid by prescription?" At the tea party, we are also reminded of the very unfortunate squint of Mr. Maguire. His dark hair, his one perfect eye, his good figure, his expressive mouth were all lost in that dreadful perversion of vision. It was a misfortune so great as to justify him in demanding that he should be judged by different laws than those which are used as to the conduct of the world at large. In getting a wife, he might surely use his tongue with more freedom than another man, seeing that his eye was so much against him. This is a tragicomic situation. It's led me to wonder why Mr. Maguire did not wear an eye patch. The tea party passes rather uneventfully with a conversation about the decorum and decline of polite society in general. I did find interesting the observation by Mr. Maguire that, quote, "Men and women are anxious to give you the best that they have, but it is in order that you may admire their wealth and their taste, and they strive to be really amusing and sarcastic. But again, that is for the éclat they are to gain." Rather cynical view of social gatherings. Mr. Maguire also confides to Miss Mackenzie that Mrs. Stumfold is as cold as ice and that this places a strain on her marriage. In chapter 12, Mrs. Stumfold interferes. Mr. Maguire's efforts continue in this vein. In fact, on 2 occasions, he makes cryptic comments to Miss Mackenzie about his desire that he will be with her, while noting that he cannot be with her right now. And he whispers the words to her from behind her in the second instance. In that encounter, Miss Mackenzie, quote, "had been startled, and she turned around and found herself close to his dreadful eye. She had never been this close to it before, and it frightened her." Side note, Miss Mackenzie was written in 1864. The surgical correction of squint, also known as strabismus, was initially performed in Germany in 1839, and use of the procedure was in fact spreading to other parts of Europe and the UK by the 1850s. I guess that spread did not include Littlebath. Perhaps Mr. Maguire is intentionally trying to add an air of mystery to counteract his deformity. Again, tragicomic. Adding next to the mystery is the visit that Mrs. Stumfold pays to Miss Mackenzie. This is apparently a very unusual situation. And Mrs. Stumfold addresses Miss Mackenzie in a condescending manner with, quote, "words that had in them an intention of kindness, but the voice and the look of the lady, if kind, were not tender." Mrs. Stumfold goes on to tell Miss Mackenzie that she should feel herself fortunate to be included among those invited to the Stumfold evenings, and then abruptly asks, "Is there anything between you and my husband's curate, Mr. McGuire?" Miss Mackenzie replies by telling Miss S she has no right to ask such a question, which offends and outrages Mrs. Stumfold, resulting in her countenance and a look of awful authority, sufficient, no doubt, to bring most Stumfoldian ladies to their bearings. But Miss M is not like most Stumfoldian ladies, and she refuses to answer the question. Mrs. Stumfold, outraged, tells Miss Mackenzie that she will come by her ruin and that she is unfit to guide her own step. She also tells Miss Mackenzie that there is another young woman who already has prior claim upon Mr. McGuire, and she hopes that Miss Mackenzie will not interfere with that other young lady's activities. Quote, "What would you think if you were interfered with? Though perhaps as you had not your fortune in early life, you may never have known what that was." Ouch. The Real Housewives have nothing on Mrs. Stumfold. There is an implication here of a relationship between Mr. McGuire and Mrs. Stumfold, which is now threatened by the allure of Miss Mackenzie's riches. Mr. McGuire's earlier comments regarding Mrs. Stumfold's coldness also suggest a relationship that is going sideways. Considering that these are two people who hold themselves out to the outer world to be very religious, I guess hypocrisy is alive and well in Littlebath. The story continues to chapter 13, in which Mr. McGuire finally formally asks Miss Mackenzie if she will share his lot with his. She knows that the answer is no. However, she asks for 2 weeks to consider before providing an answer. The deliberations on this matter are immediately interrupted by the news early in chapter 14, Tom Mackenzie's bedside, that Miss Mackenzie's brother Tom is terminally ill with an inward tumor, cancer. Immediately upon receiving this news, Miss Mackenzie makes her way to London. We are first treated to another episode of bad feminine behavior, this time on the part of Sarah Mackenzie, Tom's wife. We know from earlier chapters that Sarah and Tom were not fond of Miss Mackenzie, primarily due to her alliance with brother Walter, as well as the perceived class difference between wealthy Walter and poor Tom, who squandered his inheritance. And then Miss Mackenzie's inheritance of Walter's wealth has further soured the relationship. Due to the Stumfoldian edict, there was no Sunday mail delivery in Littlebath, so Miss Mackenzie did not receive the letter with the tidings of Tom's illness until the Monday post. She traveled as soon as she could on Monday to reach London midday. However, Sarah and Tom, expecting she would receive the letter on Sunday, expected her on the first train. And even upon Miss Mackenzie's explanation regarding the mail situation, Sarah, quote, "was stupid and wouldn't understand, but persisted in her grievance, declaring that Tom was killing himself with disappointment." Sarah also goes on to suggest that it's fret about the money that has done it all. Since the day Walter's shocking will was read, he's never been himself for an hour, essentially laying the blame for Tom's cancer at Miss Mackenzie's feet. Nice. Miss Mackenzie learns that there will be essentially nothing left to the family upon Tom's passing, and she determines to give up half of her inheritance to Sarah and the children. Chapter 15, the tearing of the verses. This is an emotional and poignant chapter. As Tom Mackenzie lies dying, Miss Mackenzie sends a letter to Mr. McGuire. This is the conclusion of the 2 weeks, politely declining his offer of marriage and wishes him well. He keeps trying in his subsequent letter, which she ignores. Miss Mackenzie is also presented by her brother Tom with the request that she marry Mr. Rubb. In that way, Miss Mackenzie's wealth could be shared with Mr. Rubb, which could then presumably be invested back into the business and provide an income for Sarah. In this way, Tom would be able to think that he, by the work of his life, had left something behind to his wife and family. Miss Mackenzie tells Tom that she cannot consider this and reassures him that she will make sure that Sarah and the children are well provided for. Tom acquiesces to her wish that he not ask her again, but he turned his face from her and thought of the bitterness of his deathbed. Tom dies in the middle of the night, about 2 weeks after the above exchange. There is a brief hiatus from discussion of money matters following the time of his death until his burial. However, on the afternoon of the burial, Sarah, crying, tells Miss Mackenzie that she would earn her bread if she knew how. Miss Mackenzie kindly states that there will be no occasion for that, Sarah. There will be enough for us all. This is a touching and remarkable example of kindness and magnanimity. The title of this chapter refers to an action which Miss Mackenzie undertakes, symbolizing her evolution from childhood dreaming to adult reality. She has brought with her a small writing desk that contains remnants of writings from her early days. Quote, "What business had such a one as she to talk of the sphere's tunes and the silvery moon, of bright stars shining and hearts repining? She would not for worlds have allowed anyone to know what a fool she had been. She would have been covered with confusion if her rhymes had fallen into the hands of any one of them. They were her expressions of poetry, of romance and poetry that had been in her. And although the expressions doubtless were poor, the romance and the poetry of her heart had been high and noble." This passage calls to mind the moving scene in chapter 9, in which Miss Mackenzie appreciates her own physical beauty and kisses herself in the mirror. These sensual feelings and emotions are shown to be lying within us glowing embers, having lain so for decades, just awaiting a rush of oxygen to bring them to full flame. Miss Mackenzie tears the verses up into tiny pieces and prepares to meet her new changed circumstance, having reduced her fortune by half. She accepts John's invitation to go to the Cedars, and while there, she will ask her attorney, Mr. Slowe, to prepare the arrangements for the division of her property. Quote, "Then she could make up her mind as to the manner and whereabouts of her future life. She was all at sea again." Now at the Cedars, in chapter 16, Lady Ball's grievance, we see that Miss Mackenzie has given up her lodgings in Littlebath. Sir John grasps the opportunity to ask Miss M if she has found any lovers, remarking that women have plenty of lovers when they have plenty of money. Miss Mackenzie asks Mr. Ball to accompany her to the office of Mr. Slowe, the attorney, to discuss the division of her inheritance, as she plans to have him serve as a trusted advisor for her in the division of her fortune. John agrees to act in this capacity and to accompany her, and Lady Ball is very interested in this turn of events, probing as to what will happen to Miss Sarah Mackenzie and the children. And Miss Mackenzie finally tells her of the plan to divide her fortune. Lady Ball is shocked and upset, utters that Miss Mackenzie, having been in possession of half of Jonathan Ball's money, at least brought some comfort. Miss M pushes back and says that the money belongs to her. She can do with it as she chooses. Lady Ball tells her that she will disgrace herself if she gives away half of the money. Did it not all come from the Balls? By this point, poor Miss Mackenzie is beginning to hate her money. A strained evening occurs, softened only by John Ball's gentle treatment of Miss Mackenzie. Sir John takes the opportunity to tell Miss Mackenzie, "I don't know what's the matter with you, but you look as though you've been doing something you were ashamed of." This prompted my marginal note, "I hate Sir John." Lady Ball had in truth mistaken her niece's character. Trollope states she had found her to be unobtrusive, gentle, and unselfish, and she had conceived, therefore, that she must be weak and compliant. As to many things, she was compliant, and as to some things, she was weak. But there was in her composition a power of resistance and self-sustenance on which Lady Ball had not counted. When conscious of absolute ill usage, she would fight well, and she would not bow her neck to any Mrs. Stumfold or to Lady Ball. Now the momentous events of chapter 17, Mr. Slowe's chambers, occur. On the way to see Mr. Slowe, Miss M tells John of her plan to divide the fortune. John, of course, has been primed for this conversation by his mother, who has repeated to him many times the story of the wrong that was done. But there was no need for repetition to him. Quote, "He had thought of it for the last 20 years, almost hourly, till it was graven upon his very soul. He had been a ruined, wretched, moody man because of his uncle Jonathan's will. John, however, will not advise Miss M how to proceed. Additionally, he notes that there was about her a quiet power of endurance, a comeliness and a womanly softness, which seemed to fit her altogether for his wants and wishes." They proceed to the chamber. While there, John's gaze falls upon a parchment that is on the floor. Apparently, this was the filing system in the office. And the parchment reads, "Jonathan Ball to John Ball, Jr., deed of gift." as we say in the United States, wait, what? John reflects, sitting there with his chin resting on his umbrella, that Mr. Slow had acted for the two Ball brothers, John and Jonathan. John recalls that there had been intention on the part of Uncle Jonathan, prior to the argument with his brother, to make over to him, John, a certain property in London, and that the money that the Mackenzies had inherited had come from this property. John remembered that the property was to pass to him the day he became of age, and that this had all changed because of the quarrel which had taken place with his uncle. His father never spoke of it, but his mother had told him that Uncle Jonathan had given it and taken it back again. Miss M proceeds with telling Mr. Slow about her plans to divide the fortune. Mr. Slow urges that she should put this off and think about it some more. Miss M declines and wants to push forward with this. Mr. Slow states that he would like to have a word or two alone with Miss Mackenzie for 15 to 20 minutes, and John Ball is shown into the outer room. After 45 minutes, the door opens, and Miss M and Mr. Slow appear. And Miss M, who John observes, is very pale, with Mr. Slow bearing, quote, that smile which men put on when they wish to cover the disagreeable seriousness of the moment. Tribulation is the title of chapter 18. Miss Mackenzie tells John promptly that she has received dreadful news, and essentially that she is to be a beggar. I shall have nothing. She asks his advice and states that she is supposed to return to see Mr. Slow in 1 week. John is understanding fully what's happening, and to his credit, tries to tell Miss Mackenzie that maybe she should not be telling him what she knows. Remarkable restraint. Miss Mackenzie goes to Gower Street to tell Sarah the news. Sarah tells her to fight it. Mr. Rubb once again tries to ask her to marry him, won't be able to provide any support. He's not very much help. In chapter 19, showing how two of Miss Mackenzie's lovers behave, we see that the day after the dramatic events of above, Miss Mackenzie is unable to get out of bed due to our favorite Trollopean tool to indicate distress, a headache. Lady Ball does not let that hold her back, though. She is aware that something of great magnitude has happened. However, she does not know the specifics. She is as kind and patient as we expect, which means not at all. She tries to find out from Miss M what's happening, but does not learn anything. Mr. McGuire makes one more attempt to get Miss M to marry him, this time attempting her with the lure of a position at a new church. However, to secure the position, he needs £2,000, and this must happen right away. He promises her that they can get a carriage. She declines. Next, Mr. Rubb comes to visit and tells her that he should fight for the money. And in fact, if she will become Mrs. Rubb, he will do the fighting for her. Miss M declines, and Mr. Rubb angrily eventually leaves the house, passing John Ball on his way out. In chapter 20, showing how the third lover behaved, the news is starting to get around at the Cedars that the fortune is to be returned to John Ball. Old Lady Ball is delighted. She is trying to be magnanimous towards Miss Mackenzie and tells her that she thinks she is well suited to earning her bread by being a lady's companion, an idea against which Miss Mackenzie pushes back sharply. Lady Ball is struck by this. Quote, she had never heard Margaret speak out so freely, even in the days of her undoubted heiressship. And though she greatly disliked her niece, she could not avoid mingling something of respect and something almost amounting to fear in her dislike. Old Lady Ball, injured, states, I thought I was advising you for the best, and I hope that you would have been thankful. Sheesh. John Ball travels to London to finalize the plans, the arrangements for the money, and on his return, Miss Mackenzie walks to meet him at the station. On the way back to the house, he asks her to take his arm and says that he will tell her his plan. His plan is that she should be his wife, and he utters the words that everyone loves to hear, leave the rest to me. Margaret, quote, still stood before him, but answered him not a word. How often since the tidings of her loss had reached her, had the idea of such a meeting as this come before her? How often she had seemed to listen to such words as those he now spoke to her. Her imagination had been at work during long hours of the night, and the romance of the thing had filled her mind, and the poetry of it had been beautiful to her. Now the poetry had come to be fact, and the romance had turned itself into reality, and the picture formed by her imagination had become a living truth. The very words of which she had dreamed had been spoken to her. Miss Mackenzie accepts his offer, and John Ball kisses her. And that is the conclusion of chapter 20.